When a disabled veteran is accused of trespassing, he enters the courtroom expecting nothing more than judgment and dismissal. But as his identity and heroic past are revealed, the room is left in stunned silence. What follows is a powerful story of respect and the unshakable strength of the human spirit. The morning air was sharp, biting at exposed skin and sinking through layers of worn-out clothing. Daniel Harris, a 68-year-old disabled veteran, sat hunched on a small bench outside a bustling cafe. The city moved around him, a cacophony of car horns, hurried footsteps, and distant chatter, but it all felt like background noise, something that didn't quite touch him anymore. Daniel adjusted his fraying jacket and tightened the scarf around his neck. His belongings, a small duffel bag and a folded blanket, rested at his feet. In his trembling hands was a steaming cup of coffee, handed to him earlier by a kind passer-by. He stared at the rising tendrils of steam, his calloused fingers curling tightly around the paper cup as if holding on to the last shred of warmth he could find. It wasn't always like this. Once Daniel Harris had been someone who mattered, a leader, a protector. He had been Sergeant Harris of the 82nd Infantry Division, a man others trusted with their lives. His name had been spoken with respect. But now, it seemed like the world had forgotten him, and maybe he had forgotten himself too. The chaos of the battlefield surged around him. Gunfire cracked in the air, and the acrid scent of smoke and blood filled his nostrils. Daniel shouted orders over the roar, his voice hoarse but steady, a lifeline for his men. They trusted him to lead them out, to bring them home, and he did. Time and again, Daniel had risked everything, putting himself between his men and the enemy. But the scars of war didn't stay on the battlefield. They followed him home, invisible to the world around him, but heavy on his shoulders. Back in the present, Daniel shook himself out of the memory. It didn't help to linger on the past. It only made the reality of his present sting more. He looked around at the cafe's patrons through the glass windows. Inside, people laughed over steaming mugs, tapping away on laptops or chatting animatedly. Their world seemed so far removed from his own, as if a thick pane of glass separated him not just from the warm interior of the cafe, but from the life he had once known. "Hey, you can't sit here forever," came a sharp voice cutting through his thoughts. Daniel looked up to see the cafe manager standing at the door, arms crossed, her expression tense. "We've had complaints," she continued, her tone clipped. "It doesn't look good for the business, you sitting out here." Daniel's jaw tightened. He had heard it all before, seen the sideways glances, the uncomfortable expressions of people who didn't want to be reminded of someone like him, someone they'd rather not think about. "I'm not bothering anyone," Daniel said quietly, his voice rough from years of silence and the cold. But the manager shook her head. "I'm sorry, but I have to ask you to leave. I can't have you sitting here." Before Daniel could respond, the sound of sirens grew louder. His stomach sank as a police car pulled up to the curb. 2 officers stepped out, their expressions professional but weary, as though they had done this a dozen times before. One officer, a tall man with a kind face, approached him. "Sir," he said, his tone firm but not unkind, "we've had complaints. You can't stay here. It's considered trespassing." Daniel stared at the ground, his grip tightening on the coffee cup. He didn't argue. What was the point? Years of discipline had taught him to follow orders without question, and this was no different. Quietly, he picked up his duffel bag and stood, his joints aching with the effort. He began to walk away, head low, when the officer stopped him. "Wait," the officer said. "I'm sorry, but we've been told to book you for trespassing. It's policy." Daniel froze. The words hit him harder than he expected. He turned slowly, his face unreadable, and allowed himself to be led to the police car. It wasn't the first time he'd felt the cold metal of handcuffs, but it didn't sting any less. The weight of humiliation pressed heavily on his chest as he was driven to the station. The holding cell was cold and stark, the steel bench beneath him chilling him to the bone. Daniel sat in the corner, his hands resting on his knees as his thoughts drifted. He thought about the thousands of nights he had spent like this, alone, forgotten, and unwanted. When an officer handed him a piece of paper with a court date scribbled across it, Daniel barely looked at it before tucking it into his pocket. He nodded mutely, too tired to protest or ask questions. Deep down, he wondered if it even mattered anymore. Would anyone care about his side of the story? Would anyone even bother to listen? As he lay back on the hard bench, his eyes closing against the harsh fluorescent light, Daniel's mind drifted once again to the past. To a time when his name meant something. To a time when he wasn't just another shadow on the street. And, for the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel something he thought he'd lost long ago. Anger. Anger at the system, at the world that had moved on without him, and at himself for letting it happen. But beneath that anger, buried deep, was something else, something fragile. Hope. It was faint, like the last embers of a dying fire, but it was there. For the first time in years, Daniel wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew that the courtroom, for better or worse, would be his next battlefield, and this time he wasn't sure if he had the strength to fight. The courtroom was buzzing with quiet murmurs, the kind that swelled and faded like the tide. Daniel Harris stood near the entrance, clutching his worn duffel bag. His mismatched jacket hung loosely on his shoulders, and his old boots scuffed against the polished floor as he shuffled toward the defendant's seat. Every step felt like a march toward judgment, not just from the law, but from the rows of strangers whose whispered assumptions weighed heavier than the handcuffs had. The bailiff called for order, and the low hum of conversation died down. The judge's chambers opened, and Judge Margaret Lawson entered, her presence commanding and sharp. Her dark hair was streaked with gray, and her piercing eyes missed nothing as she surveyed the room. "Please rise," the bailiff announced, his voice firm. Daniel pushed himself up slowly, his leg aching with every inch. The strain of age and old wounds showed in his movements, but no one seemed to notice. To the courtroom, he was just another man who had lost his way. As everyone sat, Daniel cast a glance around the room. The prosecutor, a young man in a crisp suit, rifled through his papers. The crowd behind him, a mix of curiosity seekers and passers-by, watched with guarded expressions. He felt their judgment before a single word was spoken. The first time Daniel had faced a room full of eyes, it wasn't in a courtroom. It was in the aftermath of a successful mission overseas. His unit had returned battered but alive, and their commanding officer had presented Daniel with a medal for valor. "Sergeant Harris," the officer had said, his voice steady, "you went above and beyond the call of duty. Your courage saved lives today." The applause that followed was deafening. Daniel's chest had swelled with pride, his brothers in arms clapping him on the back, their eyes filled with respect and gratitude. But that was decades ago. The medals now sat at the bottom of his bag, forgotten relics of a life that no longer felt real. "Case 2579, the clerk called out, jolting Daniel from his thoughts. "Daniel Harris, charged with trespassing." The judge picked up the file, her eyes scanning it with practiced efficiency. "Mr. Harris, please step forward." Daniel stood, his hands trembling slightly as he approached the bench. He kept his gaze on the floor, the weight of the room pressing down on him. The prosecutor spoke first, detailing the events of the trespassing charge in a detached, clinical tone. Daniel barely listened. He had heard it all before. His crime wasn't violent or dangerous. It was simply existing in a space where people didn't want to see him. "Mr. Harris," Judge Lawson said, her voice steady, "do you have anything to say in your defense?" Daniel hesitated. His throat felt dry, and his words caught somewhere between his heart and his mouth. He finally looked up, his eyes meeting the judge's. "I wasn't trying to hurt anyone," he said quietly. "I was just sitting there, trying to rest." The courtroom fell silent. For a moment, Judge Lawson said nothing, her eyes fixed on him. Then she glanced back at the file in her hands, flipping through the pages with a furrowed brow. "Mr. Harris," she said, her tone softer now, "it says here you served in the military. Is that correct?" Daniel nodded, unsure where this was going. "Yes, ma'am. I served in the 82nd Infantry Division." The judge froze, her hand still on the page she had been reading. Her eyes narrowed, her expression shifting from professional detachment to something warmer, more personal. "Did you serve during Operation Iron Dagger?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel's breath caught. He hadn't heard those words in years. "Yes, ma'am," he said slowly. "I was there." The judge leaned back in her chair, her face visibly moved. "My father," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "was a medic in that operation. He used to tell us stories about a man who saved his life, a sergeant who stayed behind to cover his unit's retreat. That man was you, wasn't it?" A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Daniel's eyes widened as memories of that fateful day flooded back. The chaos, the gunfire, the split-second decision to hold his ground while his unit escaped. He had never thought it would be remembered, never thought anyone would care. "I was just doing my job," Daniel said, his voice cracking. "I didn't do anything special." But Judge Lawson shook her head. "You risked your life to save others, Mr. Harris. That's not something we forget." The crisp morning air hit Daniel as he stepped out of the courthouse. The weight on his chest felt lighter, but the disbelief still lingered in his mind. The crowd from the courtroom was dispersing, but a few people stayed behind, their curious glances replaced with admiration. A man in a suit walked up to him, hand outstretched. "Mr. Harris, I just wanted to thank you for your service," he said, his voice warm. "What the judge said in there, it really hit home. My grandfather was a veteran, too. You're a true hero." Daniel muttered a quiet, "Thank you," as they shook hands. He wasn't used to being addressed with such respect anymore. His gaze wandered to the people around him. They no longer seemed like faceless strangers. He caught a few nods, a few shy smiles. For once, he wasn't invisible. Daniel returned to the small park bench where his troubles had begun. The familiar chill in the air was no longer oppressive. It felt almost refreshing. He sat down, his worn duffel bag at his side, and let himself breathe. For years he had walked these streets carrying the burden of being forgotten. Now, for the first time in decades, there was a flicker of hope. He reached into his bag and pulled out a folded letter, one he had written to himself years ago, but had never had the courage to read again. The words were simple, written in his neat military handwriting. "You fought for them. You mattered once. Someday you'll matter again." Daniel stared at the paper for a long moment before folding it carefully and tucking it back into the bag. Maybe the letter had been right. The following day, Daniel woke to an unfamiliar sound, a knock at the door of the small shelter room Judge Lawson had arranged for him. He swung his legs over the bed, his stiff joints protesting, and opened the door to see a woman holding a clipboard. "Mr. Harris, my name's Rachel. I'm with the Veterans Outreach Program," she said, her smile warm but professional. "Judge Lawson asked us to check in on you. She's very insistent that we make sure you're taken care of." Daniel's instinct was to push her away, to tell her he didn't need help, but something about her calm demeanor made him pause. He stepped aside, allowing her to enter. The room was bare, a bed, a small table, and a chair, but it was more than Daniel had had in years. Rachel noticed his hesitation and gestured toward the table. "Why don't we sit and talk for a bit? No pressure, just a conversation." As they sat, Rachel began explaining the program's services. "We offer housing assistance, medical care, and counseling for veterans. We also run a community center where veterans can connect with each other. You'd be surprised how many people share similar experiences." Daniel nodded along, though he wasn't sure if he could trust what she was offering. Years of being ignored and dismissed had made him skeptical, but as Rachel spoke, he felt a small crack in his defenses. "What do I have to do?" he asked finally. "Just be willing to try," Rachel said simply. A week later, Daniel found himself standing at the door of the community center Rachel had mentioned. The building was small but welcoming, with bright windows and a simple sign that read, "Veterans Welcome." Inside, the hum of a conversation greeted him. A group of men and women sat around a table, chatting and laughing in a way that felt strangely familiar. Daniel hesitated at the door, his nerves kicking in. He hadn't been part of a group since his days in the military. "Hey there!" A cheerful voice broke through his thoughts. A stocky man with a broad smile approached him. "You must be Daniel. I'm Frank. Been hearing a lot about you. Welcome." Daniel managed a small smile and shook Frank's hand. Frank led him to the table, where introductions were made. The veterans at the table ranged in age, from younger men fresh out of service to older men who, like Daniel, had carried their stories in silence for too long. At first, Daniel stayed quiet, listening as the others shared stories of their lives. Frank spoke about losing his leg to an IED, but finding a new sense of purpose in helping others. A young woman, Lisa, talked about her struggles with PTSD after returning home. The honesty in their words was both humbling and comforting. For the first time in years, Daniel felt like he wasn't alone. As weeks turned into months, Daniel became a regular at the community center. The staff and other veterans welcomed him with open arms, and slowly, he began to share more of his story. He found himself helping out with small tasks around the center, organizing events, mentoring younger veterans, and even leading discussions about coping with life after service. One day, Rachel approached him with an idea. "Daniel, we're hosting a town hall meeting about veterans' issues next month. We'd love for you to speak." Daniel froze. Public speaking wasn't something he had ever imagined himself doing, especially not about his own life. But Rachel's confidence in him was infectious. "You don't have to tell the whole world everything," she said gently. "Just share what's in your heart. People need to hear it." After much thought, Daniel agreed. He spent weeks preparing, writing, and rewriting his speech, unsure if his words would matter. But the day of the meeting arrived, and as he stood at the podium, facing a room full of veterans, community members, and local officials, he realized something. This wasn't just about his story. It was about all the men and women who had been through what he had. It was about showing them that they weren't alone. Daniel's voice shook as he began, but it grew steadier with each word. He spoke about the struggles of coming home, the weight of feeling invisible, and the kindness that had brought him back from the brink. "I thought I was forgotten," he said, his voice breaking. "But what I've learned is that we're never truly alone. There's always someone willing to help if we're brave enough to let them." The room erupted into applause when he finished. But what struck Daniel the most were the faces in the crowd, people wiping away tears, nodding in understanding, and clapping with genuine respect. Daniel's life didn't change overnight, but the pieces began to fall into place. He secured a modest apartment, decorated with photos of his military days and new memories from the community center. He continued volunteering, mentoring veterans, and speaking at events. One afternoon, as he walked past the cafe where his troubles had begun, the manager spotted him through the window. She hesitated, then stepped outside. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice shaky. "For what happened before. I didn't know who you were." Daniel smiled, the bitterness that once filled him replaced with forgiveness. "It's okay. I've moved on." As he walked away, a sense of peace washed over him. He wasn't defined by his struggles anymore. He was defined by his resilience. For the first time in years, Daniel Harris allowed himself to hope, not just for himself, but for all those like him who were still searching for their way home. Months passed, and Daniel Harris's life transformed in ways he never imagined. His modest apartment had become a sanctuary of both old memories and new beginnings. The walls bore framed photos of his military days. The medals he had once buried in his duffel bag now displayed proudly on a small shelf. Alongside them were handwritten thank you notes from veterans he had mentored and letters from families who had been inspired by his story. The community center became Daniel's second home. His days were filled with purpose, leading veteran support groups, organizing outreach programs, and offering a listening ear to those struggling to find their way. The scars of his past were still there, but now they served as reminders of how far he had come. One day, Rachel approached him with an invitation. "Daniel, the mayor's office is hosting an event to honor veterans, and they want you to be the keynote speaker." Daniel hesitated. Public speaking still made him nervous, but Rachel's confidence in him was unshakable. "Your story matters," she said. It's helped so many people already, and it can help even more. On the day of the event, Daniel stood before a crowd in the town's largest hall. Rows of veterans, community members, and families filled the space, their faces expectant. He took a deep breath and began. "When I returned home after my service, I thought my battles were over," he said, his voice steady and clear. "But the hardest battles weren't fought overseas. They were fought here, against loneliness, invisibility, and the weight of feeling forgotten." He paused, scanning the crowd. "But what I've learned is that no one is truly forgotten. Sometimes all it takes is one act of kindness, one moment of understanding, to change everything." The audience was silent, captivated by his words. We, as veterans, carry the weight of our service, but we don't have to carry it alone. And for those who see us on the streets, in shelters, or in places we never expected to be, don't look away, because every one of us has a story, and every one of us matters. When he finished, the hall erupted in applause. Strangers approached him afterward, shaking his hand, thanking him for his service and for sharing his journey. But what moved Daniel most were the quiet moments. Young veterans pulling him aside to say, "You gave me hope," or older veterans nodding silently, their eyes filled with gratitude. One crisp autumn afternoon, Daniel found himself walking through the town. He stopped by the park bench where his arrest had set this journey in motion. He sat down, letting the sun warm his face, and reflected on how far he had come. A young boy ran past, laughing as he chased a kite. His mother, sitting nearby, smiled at Daniel and gave him a polite nod. It was a small gesture, but it reminded him of how much had changed. Not just in his life, but in how the world around him now saw him. Daniel spent the rest of his days continuing his work with the veterans community, but his legacy extended far beyond the walls of the center. His story became a symbol of resilience and hope, inspiring others to see the humanity in every face and to never underestimate the power of compassion. Years later, a plaque was installed at the community center in his honor. It read, "In memory of Daniel Harris, whose courage on the battlefield was matched only by his courage to rebuild, a true hero, both in service and in life." As the sun set on another day, Daniel sat by his apartment window, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. He looked out at the world with a quiet sense of peace. His struggles had shaped him, but they no longer defined him. He had found his way home, not just to a place, but to a sense of belonging and purpose. And as he closed his eyes, the words he had written to himself so many years ago came to mind. "You fought for them. You mattered once. Someday you'll matter again." Daniel smiled, knowing he always had. Daniel Harris's journey reminds us that no one is ever too far gone to be seen, heard, and valued. From the streets to the courtroom, and ultimately to a place of purpose, his story is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the transformative power of compassion. His struggles didn't define him. His ability to rise above them did. Daniel's life became a beacon of hope for those still fighting their own battles, proving that with understanding and support, brighter days are always possible. If Daniel's story inspired you, remember that there are countless real-life veterans who need our support. Let's honor their service by extending kindness, donating to veteran organizations, or simply taking the time to listen to their stories. Like, share, and subscribe to keep spreading messages of hope and resilience. Together, we can make a difference.